that you're stuck in Beltway traffic because that's no fun. And Sam, it's Sam. I hope you're doing well, Sam. I'm sorry you're in Beltway traffic. Oh, Sam, it's so good to see you, Miss Willem. I hope you're doing well. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing lovely. We're having just storms and weather like crazy, but we're alive, so that's good. And
Oh,
so that is well. All of my squash has died, but we do have tomatoes, so that's good. And Seth is sitting in Beltway traffic, so he's not moving, so he's enjoying himself. But no, we are good. The kids are good, so all is well. I'd be curious if anyone's thinking about anything. What have I been thinking about? How to keep deer from eating squash, I guess. But I'd be curious if anyone's thinking of anything.
Hmm. Lately I've been reading Nightwood by Juna Barnes.
Oh,
Have you read it?
I have not read it. How is it?
It's good. When I first Googled it, I looked at the Wikipedia page and kind of the front and center, they're like, this is the first book to ever depict lesbian sexual lesbian sex. Is that
Okay,
what it's about? But then I kept reading and I realized, oh, like T.S. Eliot has written the introduction to this, so it's got to be
oh,
good.
right.
He doesn't write that many intros.
No, he doesn't.
Um, so I've started reading it, and it's not primarily about lesbian sex. It's actually I don't even know what it's about, but it is like the strangest use of like the English language.
Huh.
Actually, now come to think of it, I'm like wondering if it's translated, but I don't think it is. I think it's originally English. Um,
Hmm.
but it's so rich, but so weird. It really when you I found this reading like when I first read Proust, I was like, you could tell that it didn't live inside of English well. Like
Right.
there's something profoundly strange about it being translated to English. And I'm getting this sense, but I think that it's originally English.
I'm very curious if T.S. Eliot wrote the introduction because Eliot's a big deal for me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it is language. Or sorry, it is in fact language. We can confirm it's language.
Yes.
No, it's English.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what caught my attention as well. And the introduction is sweet and quite praiseful. Um, but yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
Well, that's fantastic, Sam. I'm curious when you say that it feels like it's straining on language. Seth and I, when he was at the house, we talked a lot about language and actually freeing oneself from language that has meaning and seeing what shows up with
Mm.
the sounds. And it was very, very interesting conversation. But I'm
Hmm.
curious what you mean when you say that there's this way which the language seems like it's fighting or it's trying to do something. What do you mean by that, Sam? That's interesting.
I think I have to be very attentive when I'm reading it because there's layers of metaphor that become it creates this weird rhizome of significance that you normally don't put together. I think this kind of conversation might be very pertinent today because with the rise of AI, you've got these theories of language, talking about how language is this innately I forget the term, auto generative or auto
Sure.
regenerative, but just that AI is constantly trying to predict what the next word will be. What is the thing which should follow the word the? In that case, there's many, but maybe for the word luminescent, there's only a few words, say, that might commonly follow that.
Hmm.
And so there's this tactic of just creating intelligence out of likelihood or something that AI is participatory to. But if we think about what Juna is writing, it feels like she's using words that just shouldn't follow the one word that precedes it. And it
Hmm.
creates these really rich metaphors. And like I'm saying, they're kind of creating this rhizomatic imagery where you've got I don't know, there's this extended metaphor of this woman as half woman, half wild beast. She kind of straddles the line between when like animal evolves into human, and it like leads the character to feel like this urge to eat her, like
Hmm,
I don't know, which is also like I don't know, like a metaphor for his desire for her.
right.
I don't know. Anyways, it's just it's a very maybe it's not even that it like feels un-English, but that yeah, it feels like just not average English.
Hmm. I'm really take first. I love the friend Michael. Good to see you. So we're talking about a novel I have not read that I'm gonna have to change. That T.S. Eliot wrote. What's the name of the novel again, Sam? Give it to me one more time.
Nightwood.
Night Wood. So I'm very taken, and Sam is speaking on the very unique way it uses language, and I'm really taken by two phrases. One, AI is intelligence as likelihood. Yeah, that's grand. That's really nice because that is what it is. It's like we're intelligent if we can determine what's likely. That's very interesting, and that also, almost by definition, has a kind of enslavement logic to it. Like you're enslaved to the likely, you're enslaved
Yeah,
to the probable. And it's funny to think, just kind of playing with that phrase, there's a sense in which AI is trying to make the probabilistic deterministic. So it's
yeah,
kind of like a loss of freedom. So, and then to what degree AI can train us to practically make the probabilistic the deterministic is to the degree it will then seem to always succeed. So there's kind of like a subtle incentive for AI to train us to follow probability because then that will make it seem as if it can replace us or be just as good of us. Now I'm being a little conspiratorial there, but it's just very interesting to think that AI is actually, in a sense, bound to the probable and kind of makes probability deterministic. That's an interesting thought. The other phrase you pointed out that I think is just very interesting is this idea of writing in night wood, where words follow that shouldn't follow, that don't seem like they should follow. And that just kind of makes me think about what it would be like to write a sentence like that. When you're writing and you go, wait a minute. No, don't use that word. Let me use, no, that's still too likely. That's still too likely. And you really would have to be really thoughtful as you wrote a sentence to try to not pick a word that is probable and yet still
mhm.
sensible. That seems like it would be really hard. The only other thing I say, and I'll give it to anyone, is it makes me think of Hart Crane. Hart Crane is a very important poet. He wrote The Bridge, and one of the things a lot of people, kind of didn't think much of Hart Crane, but Harold Bloom loved him. And one of the reasons is because Hart Crane are using these metaphors that seem like mixed metaphors. They don't really seem to work. But actually, for Bloom, that was part of what opened up the poetic genius because there's almost a difference between quality mixed metaphors, intentional mixed metaphors, and sloppy mixed metaphors. And how Hart Crane was kind of employing an intentional mixed metaphor for the sake of a particular experience that that particular mix of metaphor would generate. And I always found that interesting. I'll pause and ask if you have any other thoughts, Sam, on any of that, and then I'll give it to Seth. No pressure if not. And I know you're walking, and don't let us distract you from anything. But please, Sam.
Well, I'm just heading to the park, so
Nice.
no distractions. But yeah, just with the whole like collapsing of the probable into like making something making probability deterministic.
Hmm.
I think like the whole like it's like I feel like that's like a culmination of scientia, like as a mode of like thought. Like I feel like since we've been like doing that throughout like all of modernity, like we establish like clock time and calendars, and we make the probable highly deterministic. Like we enact like agreed probabilities just by like getting up every morning at like 9, or like going to
Yep.
work at like 9, like we just like if you like took all of that activity and you studied it as an alien, you might conclude that they can only wake up in the morning or something, like um and and I think it like it makes us forget that like maybe not so much something so much as so radical as miracle is possible, but that like novelty as such can like emergence can happen in the universe where like all that came before it is sort of reframed by the emergence of something like radically novel.
Right. I really love that. And Mr. Jockin, good to see you. I'll give it to Seth and Michael. I really like this idea that there's almost kind of a dream of autonomous rationality that is the making probability the deterministic, to close the gap to the point where probability is determinism, to achieve a kind of practical determinism, and that if we accomplish that, it's kind of the end of the age. And funny enough, the end of that age would be the end of the role of the human, right? Because we're not deterministic. And I love the part that actually there's something about clock time in modern society that's trying to make it as if humans only can get up at 9, as if they can only be at work between 9 to 5, to make it practically deterministic. One of my favorite plays is the difference between practical and technical. And we tend to say that the truth is the technical. If we say, well, we're not technically determined, so therefore we're not determined. No, no, no. The truth is the practical. The technical distinction serves ideology. We can say, since we're not technically determined, it's okay if we're practically determined. No, no, no. That little move is actually what leads to the enslavement, per se, right? So the reality is the practical, not the technical. And I just really like that idea of there's something about the dream of modernity as a kind of making the practical equal the deterministic, and how we're approaching that completeness, which then ironically, if you kind of complete that, you're forced to see it. Like the completion is the moment of seeing, which is simultaneously possible the moment of bliss or horror all at the same time. Just like opening the Lost Ark in the first Indiana Jones movie. I saw that scene way too young. Way too young. But let me pause and give that to Seth and then Michael. Seth, thank you for sitting in traffic in DC so that you could be here, sir. You're a saint.
Yeah, well, like I said, the net makes traffic better. So maybe there's a new slogan that you can work with. Yeah, so one of the things that I'm still going through the playlists on Belonging Again, and I'm in the address now. And one of the things I've been listening to is some of your dialogues with Cadell about the singularity. And, a lot of the terminology is new to me, but this idea of real, symbolic, and imaginary. And if I'm understanding right, it's just sort of like what I hear Cadell talking about. He said a number of times that science needs to begin to include the subjective. So we tend to think of science as, what you can measure and everyone agrees on. But of course, each individual has their subjectivity, and subjectivity really exists in the universe, and it's all of this. And then, so as I'm listening to you and Sam talk about language, and our recent conversations about conversation tends to go into the Nash equilibrium, and how do you get out of that? And you've to your friend Lorenzo about how neurodivergence, or just anything that we can do that would lead us to the non-rational, that's sort of like the way out of the impasse, is we stop all being rational and running to get through the door at the same time, getting stuck, and actually has something that doesn't feel rational. But I love that word non-rational, because I think I've probably felt that trap of like, oh, is this not rational? So it's bad. So
Seth, no! Seth, I hope
the
you're
traffic
okay.
took him. Well, I'm here, but you know what? Why don't I let someone else speak, and I'll try to come back, because it looks unreliable.
You are a gentleman, sir, but I appreciate what you were saying, and I hope you do bring in connections with the language and Lorenzo, et cetera, so forth. But I will give it to Michael and Mr. Jockin. But you're awesome. But let me give it here to Michael. Michael, thank you for being here, sir.
I'm glad to be here. Yeah, and Seth, feel free to just unmute at any time if it gets more reliable, and I'll pass the baton. Yeah, this is great so far. It's kind of in lockstep with what I've been thinking lately about. I'm in this. I've kind of been in various poetry classes and writing a lot more poetry, and right now I'm in a class where we're slow reading Yeats, like through his life. We all have have a copy of like basically his life's collection of poetry, and we've just finished the first week on like his early career, the Crossways and the Rose, and it's kind of this really cool way of like tracking a poet through their life and seeing the cohesive threads, what they're wrestling with, the ways in which their poetry is maturing and evolving and changing. Um, and I've just kind of been thinking generally about like what is it about poetry that no other um, medium of expression uh, you know seems to be able to attain. Like what is it about this art form that like everyone loves but is so kind of mysterious? And what I've been thinking about lately is like it attempts to communicate the obvious in an unobvious way. It's like it kind of does this like subversive thing where it will, you'll read a poem and you'll be like on one hand you'll be like, oh, that's about such and such experience or emotion or quality of existence or whatever. But it's like, but you've a good poem will be like, I've never heard um sorrow described in that way ever before. Like, and there's no one but this author that can put it that way. And what you were talking about with like um probable language and trying like with Eliot in that novel, and I really want to get my hands on that because what I've read from Eliot, it's like it's he's so obviously a master at doing that, of choosing an improbable but also at the same time logical, or maybe logical is not the right word, but like the right appropriate word for that moment. And when I write poetry, that's always what I'm thinking about. Is like, okay, if I was writing prose, maybe I'd just settle for something obvious so that I don't lose the reader in kind of this grand narrative. But like, because I don't have as many words in this poem, like I got to be really precise and also kind of think outside of the box because I'm really trying to have something that like lands and sticks with someone. Um, and I think ultimately metaphor is kind of an instrument in this kind of A-B logic, right? It's like it's taking two things that have never been thought to be compared together and uh instantiating a relationship between them. And and I think can that that can kind of even be like a metaphor for what we're doing in something like the net, where we're like taking these ideas and um people and personalities and like trying to find like an interplay that might not be obviously logical, or some internally consistent system that's like been devised and created before, but it's like we're trying to imagine or reimagine something for the first time. um and yeah, I've also heard people describe novels as, or no, sorry, you said that, Daniel. Novels are poems that can't be written in any fewer words, um, which I love as well. Even just in some of the short stories that I write, thinking that thought makes me like much more intentional with like every sentence and every word. Um, because I think when you don't think that, you often will just kind of lazily kind of write, especially if you're like setting up context, you're like, okay, this is like kind of not that important or whatever. But if you're thinking about it like as a poem, it's like you're thinking of how it's sounding sonically, how the words are mixing together, long sentences, short sentences, all of those things, to really make the words sing. Um, so I love that thought, thinking of, an art form like poetry is like, um, yeah, and you talk about, the element of surprise. It's like you're kind of you're trying to surprise the reader, but also not make it so irreverent and so like um I don't know, like odd or kind of subversive that it alienates, that it still invites you and it still feels humane. But it also surprises you. It's like how do you surprise someone about something that they already know, but by introducing it in a novel way, you're surprising them, but you're also inviting them in. Yeah, those are just some thoughts.
Well, I think that's very well put. I'll give it to Jockin and Christian here. There is something, so you mentioned this kind of relationality that poetry seems to create, but it's surprising. First off, there seems to be something about freedom and the ability to find new relation that's tied. Like our ability to find new relation seems to increase freedom because, in a way, if we just think temporally, if it's A to B and freedom is the ability to do C instead of B, then new relationality opens up new pathways in a sense, right? And if language is stuck in a single trajectory, then that's a lack of freedom. If cat must always be thought about by the same description, then there's a kind of lack of freedom there. And Aspasia, good to see you. And so this idea of poetry, language, opening up new relationships and how that seems to have something to do with freedom seems very, very important. There is also something where, like you're saying, what's very interesting is that a good poetic sentence is able to be new, but not chaos. Well, how do you get that sweet spot? Right? If I say to you, the heartless person was cold, you don't even actually have to think. You've heard this sentence so many times. It's really, really trite, right? But if I say the heartless person was in a hot air balloon, don't quite know what's going on there. Okay, I don't know why I'm bothering to listen. But if you think of something very well done, the sad person was like unworn child shoes, to allude to that famous Hemingway, Ezra Pound sort of idea, right? There's sort of a invitation in that. There's a certain sort of, but then what's very interesting is that is inviting a judgment that is between the variables. It's not reducible to the information. And I think you could really argue that a lot of language philosophy has gotten in massive trouble because it's been asking about words like cat and the definition of cat versus poems. And so as a result, the main material by which people have approached the question of language has not been properly mysterious enough, which is in this moment of like a Hart Crane poem or T.S. Eliot or Yeats or, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Like, why is it when I say that, do you not just go, okay, cool, the falcon can't hear the falconer. What's the big deal? Information received. Nah, you hear that, it's way deeper. The falcon can't hear the falconer. There's a loss of social intelligibility. The center cannot hold. Things fall apart. There's a bigger umph there. Why? Where does that bigger umph come from? Well, I think this starts to hint at a certain revelation of what human intelligence ultimately is, which is much more analogical. And I think we have to take that seriously. And there is also something about successful poetry and successful uses of language, because I know Christian has been working on consciousness, is an invitation for consciousness to wake up and not feel lost. Most of the time when we use language, we're robotic. We just kind of go through the information and don't think about it. But then if somebody uses gobbledygook language, we might wake up and go, what? It would have been better to be unconscious. Well-used language is a moment when consciousness seems to come alive, and it's like, yes. And it's like, glad it came alive, right? When somebody uses language well or art well, it's when we almost become conscious and come online, and we're glad of it. We're like, yes. And so when language for most of our lives is poorly used, there's a way in which consciousness doesn't come on. It just kind of goes through the scripts. It's more saving energy, right? And poetry is a resistance to the temptation to save energy at the expense of consciousness feeling alive and glad in it. But then of course, that suggests that we have to be careful. Well, I would argue that the more people go into AI, the more there will be a premium for the ability to speak and use language in this way being suggested. That will actually become an increasingly important human skill. There's more to say. I'll pause and then give it to Mr. Jockin, Christian, and Sam. Mr. Jockin, thank you for being here, sir.
Of course. It was good to see you, everybody. So, I mean, I see. So, Daniel, I was listening to the Goodell conversation on the map is indestructible. And actually, what caught my ear was a very important detail about dreams. So, I don't know if this was in picking up with our conversation we've had in the net before, or you had this prior, and just the net brought it up before, was the relationship of dreams with the impossible. And actually, the necessity of that. If you have coherent systems that have no dreams, it's self-enclosed. There's no strike. There's no possibility of a strike. So I brought this up before. It was, I think in last week's session, was related to, I'm in a reading group for Timaeus, and we're talking about Hora. And the area that caught my attention was this discussion about it, about the idea that in a dreamlike state, that via modes of boundary making, one can wake up with knowledge, right? And then more particularly, then we see this in Meno. So this is just, I'm summarizing what I brought up last time, right? That Meno is by mode of questioning. So by a mode of questioning, with which demarcates boundaries of non-plane by mixing the two together, one can awaken to see, basically from the dreamlike state. You know what's interesting? I somehow ended up in the laws, and the laws had a very bizarre, or not bizarre, interesting overlap. That's what I share. So it relates to, I say this because there was a note about what we call choir, which is working with music and voice. And I'm bringing this up because a lot of the commentary about Timaeus and the Hora is about this idea, but the space before language, the space before intelligibility and all the other stuff. What's interesting when you go to laws, when we talk about the choir master and choir training, it talks about this idea. Now, the language they use is that via a kind of rhythm and harmony, people are instructed with the imitational pattern of the choir maker. The translation in English is posture and position, but they're actually schemata and muskin, meaning like of the muses, possession of muses, and basically figure. This is just very interesting because that's the kind of language we see in Timaeus as well. This idea of like the form, basically that there's three kinds of form. One's an imitation of the real form. And what I'm seeing here is actually, it's really interesting. Just I want to share a note. I brought up before last week too about poetry's purpose. Aristotle says, or actually rhetoric, by the way, is bringing before the eyes intelligibility. And even Aristotle actually has a note about awakening with anageia. So to be asleep is a dumasis, a capacity, a potential. To be awake is an anageia. He gives that kind of core distinction. And that's what he's doing. He's actually demonstrating what anageia is by not definition. So that's actually on this note of dead language. It's a living word of movement between contraries. So if you want to use that dialectically, you could say it that way if you wanted to. But he's drawing an image for you by drawing out distinction. So actually, you're actually seeing the Timaeus demonstrate model presented to you in Aristotle in metaphysics to talk about anageia. I think just the other note is, and it's interesting because it relates to the kind of the study of language and cybernetics. This caught my attention because the idea of rhythm, harmony. Aristotle talked about this in health. Aristotle's conception of health is actually based on these concepts, and that's in place. So that's actually why I'm connecting all this, because I see the relationship happening between Plato's discussion of Hora as this kind, which is interesting because it's kind of said to be this absence space receptacle, and yet health for Aristotle is so essential in place, which is a kind of good dispositional arrangement of parts and potentials and capacity in place. And it's been typically discussed in the cybernetic mode with schema, figure. Schema is a kind of form that's an artificial making. So it's a kind of boundedness. It's the arrangement by force of an external other, right? External onto an object. So when you make an artifact, it's just a gathering by binding. Usually Aristotle has a note about this, by glue or string. It doesn't have, actually a quote from Timaeus, the beautiful bond of being. That natural things, of physis, have a boundedness that is of nature. And by the way, analogia is a kind of boundedness of being of one, which is very interesting. It's not an artificial aggregation. So the kind of aggregation versus abiding presence, the kind of distinction. I see this because cybernetics, I'm in another seminar over cybernetics. It's obvious, it's schematic binding by force, right? And the operations of feedback mechanisms by saying, let's make life like mechanisms. You can see the operation of thought. It's very clearly obvious. And to be fair, we're looking at the first order of cybernetics so far. But I'm bringing all this up because isn't it interesting in this Timaeus, we have this presentation of the choir master teaching my music, that there is schemata, right? There's schema, but there's also possession of the muses, which is from Phaedrus. Plato has a whole thing about that, the hierarchy of phases, meaning which is defined by what one loves. The muse that you fall in love with is a kind of clothing that dresses oneself and shapes the soul to be a certain dispositional state. So I see this in unity, and I notice that's a kind of what is good poetry, what is good art supposed to do, is to comport oneself by awakening into a certain arrangement, by falling in love to certain things that you disregarded, that you unsaw. And I talk about this language of kind of, and other sections of the laws about leaping, this leaping quality of revelation, that an awakening is a kind of a leaping of a presence that was, you were in a dream state, you were not even aware was there, and then you became aware. And this obviously the kind of tangent that tied all together prior net sessions, why is this so important, is we had flight. Flight was considered an impossibility, it was a wish, yet it came to be. And it became a rational, obvious point of course if you fly. But it's actually not the case. It's actually a radical motion of movement of impossibility became probable. It's very bad. It's an amazing movement. We actually really think it through. So what's going on here? Why did that happen? What other cases are there related to, as I think what art is meant to do, posit in front of you, in design language, we talk about this as how might we, this kind of positionality of how might we, where you're doing this kind of geopaedic kind of play, right? So that it's not just dead thought or dead conceptions that are kind of parameterized within a logic. It's playing with these thoughts and seeing what we can come out of it, what can we generate with it. It's a kind of generational mode of understanding. So I just want to kind of add notes to share with all this, and that's all I have.
Fantastic. So a few things. First, thank you for watching that talk. I really enjoyed that on The Map is Indestructible. It's wonderful. It's funny, a book sits on your computer for years and you go, oh wow. What you were just saying on finally get that done. So there's a few things, and I'll give it to Christian and Sam. Very interesting. So the impossible to the we'll say possible, or the impossible to the probable. For me, that's only possible with non-rationality. And then the movement from the probable to the determined is rationality. If you don't have non-rational, all you can do is move the possible to the determined. Therefore, you can't come up with flight. And that ultimately is AI. And what AI wants to do is close the gap between the possible and the determined to make it the practically deterministic. So the issue is also, to what you were saying, is basically we have just been using, to use language I would use, we have basically disregarded the role of the non-rational. And as a result, all we've done is map make and reconfirm the coherence of a map, and done that over and over again. Now, again, as we talked about in the talk, modernity responded to this by saying, postmodernity by saying, well, let's get a maps then. If maps just create totalitarianism, let's get rid of it. Well, you do that, people go mad. They have to have maps, right? So the question is, how do you relate to the map, which is ultimately indestructible, in a manner that is going to be maintaining the symbolic, as Seth brought up with Lacan, and social intelligibility. And yes, all your bases belong to me too, Christian. And so you have to have a map. But the distinction is maps, in a sense, are a simulacra of the Gestalt. And we've talked about James Wigley and insight and Gestalt. And you see, because humans must think in terms of Gestalts, we create maps. But the question is then, to say a lot, the issue is we have to learn to relate to our map in the Gödel point so that we can get insights of the Gestalt that we can only have access from because we have maps. But the point of maps are not for us to use them to avoid the territory or to establish a coherence, but precisely to find the point where coherence doesn't equal correspondence, and to place ourselves in our subjectivity there for the possibility of the insight of the Gestalt, for the possibility of a glimmer of beauty, etc., so forth, right? That's a very different way of using maps and a very different way of using rationality, because we've mostly been using those things to avoid the Gödel point or to establish coherence. And I'm of the opinion that basically poetry is making you think the Gödel point. It doesn't obviously use that language, but when words are used in a different way, you're going, hey, definitions Words are not limited by their definitions. And the coherence of a poem, even if it doesn't correspond with anything immediately in reality, nevertheless can invite new intelligibility. So good uses of language are actually training the subject to be the kind of being of whom can reside in the girdle point, who can use maps not to simply avoid a lack of intelligibility through the establishment of coherence, but to actually use them to find the place where, in a sense, the map breaks, so that there is the possibility of gestalts, of the insight, of the apprehension, of, well, awakening. Because basically, the dream, the unconscious dream that we are in, that we must awaken from, is the map. Maps are schemas. And basically, we've just spent a whole lot of our thinking on the creation and establishment of schemas. I really like also what you were saying about Cora and health, because there's a sense in, without health, you can't be here. Health is the ability to be present, to be here. If you're stuck in a linear use of language, then you can't be here with language. You're unconscious, quote unquote, with language. If you're not healthy in every part of you, then there's actually a part of you. There's a part of you that's taking away from you being here. So it's quite lovely to think of health as a precondition in all of its different aspects for being here, for being present. I think that is very, very important. And I definitely think that there is something about health that is the necessity of a certain awakening, and we awaken to the Gestalt. And then I'll give it to Christian, Sam, Michael, and Seth here. And for me, the non-rational is precisely the variable that makes it possible to move the impossible to the possible, and then the rational is going to move the possible to the determined, and the determined meaning make it real, make it occur. And the problem is, if we're trained out of our non-rational capacities by AI or society, then we will not be able to have our possible be derived from the impossible. Therefore, the possible will be defined by whatever is immediate, the always already whatever is there, which is likely already controlled or owned by somebody. And then all we're going to do is make that immediate probability the case, and thus contribute to our own capture and enslavement. So it is incredibly important for the human to be able to tarry with the non-rational. And I am of the opinion that poetry, art, spaces like this, etc., so forth, are precisely habituation to that, to keep yourself able to be awakened. To keep yourself awakening. But I will pause and give it to Christian. Christian, thank you for being here. So it is good to see you.
It's good to be here too. A few things. I think I've just had an interesting thought that I'm going to reflect on: dreams and non-rational thought. Then talk about Timaeus and Plato and Aristotle, and then Michael and poetry, and then a little something else at the end, I think. As I was watching the Zoom window and Sam was moving around a lot, I was suddenly reminded of, like, when I had the TikTok app for a mercifully short amount of time, there were, and I'm not comparing these two things, it just reminded me of them. There would be these TikTok videos where the visuals had nothing to do with the audio. It would be someone talking, blah, 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 blah. And then it would be like footage of someone playing Minecraft or something. Typically like a very like dopamine hitty type of thing where someone's like getting the stars, blah, blah, blah. And it's really like, this is interesting. I can feel in my brain like why it's attractive and hypnotizing. But as I was like thinking about that, I just remembered that relates to an experience I've had where, if you've ever, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but for a while, once upon a time, I was trying really hard to try to remain conscious while falling asleep. I was exploring lucid dreaming and stuff like that. But there's like a way of doing that where, instead of like kind of coming online in the dream, you maintain a thread of consciousness as your brain goes into the dreaming state. And a really strange thing happened that I would notice when I tried to do that was that my brain would seem to kind of split into two as I was falling asleep. One part of my brain continued its typical rational narrative of language, words, blah, 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 blah. The other part of my brain was like strictly images. And these two things were not related to it. They kind of bifurcated, where whatever was going on with the visual had nothing to do with the little voice. And I just realized that's very much like the TikTok videos. And so maybe that's why it like has something to do with why they're so hypnotizing. It's because it puts us in a dreamlike fugue state. But then the insight that I just had is how perhaps this is, and you might be able to like confirm my intuitions here, or maybe we're talking about different things, Daniel, but perhaps this is part of the power or what we're talking about when we talk about non-rational thought. So like my language allows me to build models of the world with greater and greater definition. Experiencing the world informs my language models, and then there's a relationship between the two. But neither captures the whole of the image of reality. And so when we run into a problem and we need to, and rational thought is failing us, maybe what we are able to do is kind of move between the like visual intelligence, maybe it's a symbolic intelligence, and a rational linear intelligence, where it's like, okay, I can't get any further with my words. I move into this other mode. There's a different kind of logic that happens here. It takes me somewhere. I feel like, I've arrived somewhere. Now I have to bring that back down into words. And that is part of the creative process of languaging stuff. And that can include poetry, not just like philosophical insight. And in fact, maybe like poetry is where you arrive somewhere that you can put into words, but you can't necessarily like trace a path with those words back to your body of rational thought, right? It's like an island that you visit. I can tell you about it with words. It's distinct from the bigger body of rational ontology and ideology that I have. So it seems non-rational, but it's not actually that it's non-rational. It's just like bespokely rational. It's a isolated kind of rationality. If you want to put it that way, I guess. So then I've been reading a lot because, as you said, I've been working on this consciousness essay. And I went back to Plato, Aristotle, and Timaeus, especially because in a very superficial reading many years ago, it turns out mistakenly, assumed that Cora, whatever, I assume your pronunciation is right, Thomas, was something to do with the spaciousness of consciousness. And it's because of like the ineffable thing that he seems to be trying to describe. The words you're using are so much like what you see in Eastern phenomenology, a receptacle, a nothingness, a space, right? And he even I love that he says it's like it's unintelligible. You arrive at it with a bastard reckoning, which is great. Maybe a lot of poetry is like it's not irrational. It's like a bastard rationality. It's a rationality that's like divorced from the parents of rationality. It retains something of it, but it's also kind of lost from it in some way. But anyway, what it seems to me upon reapproaching Timaeus is that Plato's Cora is something more like a very primitive intuition about like quantum physics, actually. Because he's saying, okay, we've got form, we've got the instantiated form, the becoming, but then he's like, well, how is it that stuff changes, basically, right? Like fire somehow turns into air, somehow turns into water. And you can derive from this that, well, it's not essentially fire. If it's mutable, there's something more fundamental to it that's going on that explains how it could change. And that's interesting. And, maybe if he lived in the era of like particle atomic theory, he would have just like kind of stopped a little short of the full trip that he took and said, oh, well, it's just like more generic particles. And now, we have photons and whatever's, right? It's electrons and that's how the things change, blah, 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 blah. But maybe by consequence of them not having a more deep theory of particle physics, the question took him deeper, right? It's like he went to like a very metaphysical base with it, which is like, how can anything change at all? How, which includes like a thing moving in space from here to there, or a thing being there versus not being there. And so then he imputes that there's this space or a receptacle. He calls it the mother, which is an interesting rhyme with the Taoist. The Tao, which can be spoken of as the mother of the 10,000 things. It's like very parsimonious, where he's like, there's this bastardly thing that it's hard to. What is it that he says? He says it's like, I love this line. Greatly unmoving. Oh, I'm in a different place. But he says it's like it's hard to use words to talk about it. And it rhymes with how people just like try to reckon with consciousness. But he has a whole other theory of conscious experience, and they're kind of similar, but they're distinct. So I think what he is talking to is more like the question of quantum physics, because he's talking about some like kind of invisible, immaterial potentiality, right? Like superpositions, particles that have not been brought into a specific position, right? Just this pure matrix of potentiality. That's my takeaway right now. But then when he does talk about phenomenology, and he only has like a very undeveloped proto-phenomenology of the soul, which says like, okay, there's physical stimulation on the body that gets turned into, I don't know the Greek word off the top of my head, but it's like a aestheia something, blah, blah. Same root word as aesthetics, but it means experience. And that like shows up in what he calls the ever-flowing stream of the soul. Now, this sounds also like certain descriptions of consciousness, like William James is the flow of consciousness, and we there's a lot that we relate between flow and consciousness. But it also shows that these are like two distinct things for Plato: the spaciousness of physical manifestation, and then something he doesn't talk about a lot, and he doesn't even use the word spaciousness. He uses the word flow to talk about where sense perceptions arrive. And it's interesting that there's like a little bifurcation there, where in the East, like there was the lean towards the phenomenology, and like the same question Plato asked about physicality, they were asking about their consciousness. But Aristotle, he doesn't really, I mean, I've read a lot of Aristotle last night, and he's so smart. I'm enjoying Aristotle because he's so brilliant and he's so wrong. It's really funny. But he says, oh, well, experience, he kind of collapses the soul into the body, except for like the intelligent soul. And that includes the experiential soul, which he says happens in the organs. And then all of those sense perceptions come into the heart, which he considers a sense organ where that's how they are unified and how distinguishment happens, blah, blah, blah. But it's like they were like, Plato was like on the precipice, like there could have been an opportunity for someone to see that insight into what Plato was saying and then develop phenomenology the way it happened in the East. But that whole project got delayed until, I guess you could say, Descartes. Anyway, so that's been a real fun trip, and I'm glad I'm finally reading Aristotle and Plato. Even though I don't believe the liver is a psychic organ, the questions that he's asking and the reasoning is so fucking brilliant, even if the conclusions are like comically wrong. I really love it. So then lastly, poetry. I think actually a lot of this can get related to poetry. And here I'll bring in a little bit of something I was thinking about this morning. I think it's almost like the thesis of this paper I'm working on, which is kind of funny that the thesis is arriving at the end instead of at the beginning. But so like basically very short version is something like there's a bit of cognitive closure when we talk about causality. And you could call it metaphysical closure, but basically, there's certain questions that I think in principle we can't ask, right? Because of infinite regress. Like, why is there anything at all? Well, once you like push the needle back, blah, 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 it just expands the question. And so there's no way to finally answer that question unless you posit something that seems kind of irrational, like an unmoved mover or whatever, right? So I think we can have like a category of question which is beyond, which is, it's just, it doesn't make sense in terms of rationality. That's maybe why certain things we talk about with poetry, including consciousness, like Rumi's, you are the whole ocean in a drop. What the fuck does that mean? Well, I don't know, but it kind of is this poetic, non-rational way of speaking to something that doesn't, you can't really talk about with pure reason. For the reasons I've just mentioned, infinite regresses, cognitive closure. And I think that this includes, this touches upon a lot of things that are really important to us, like our ethics about, conscious beings, our sense of free will. And I'll only just touch on that really quickly. I won't take you through the whole 10,000 words I'm writing. But this is the little thing that popped up into my mind this morning, which it's almost so obvious. I like someone else, a million other people have probably had the same thought and expressed it earlier and better than I have. But we have an attachment to free will, and like putting aside questions of like social responsibility, which is an interesting topic, but like I have an argument there. But like, let's just say for our personal sense of liberty or sense of meaning in life, we feel like we lose this if we lose our sense of free will. My basic argument is that our feeling of free will does have a certain justification in that I do believe consciousness is like an otherly dimensional thing that relates to the physical world. And so in that way, to the extent that we have an intuition that we like consciousness is real and it's not a, Dennett's illusion, then we can say there is something to do with us that inform, and we also have to accept that there's what's called interactionism, that there's like bilateral causation between consciousness and the material world. Then you can say, well, there's something about who I am which has causal force, but which is not enclosed in the physical world, right? And I don't think it's like, and Dennett's information, I don't think fits the bill here. And so that might give us a deep intuition that, yeah, there's a will or a causality at play here, which in some sense is free, but not free again in a way where there's like some ultimate unmoved mover who's like pulling the levers of what would that even mean, right? And so, okay, so there's like an argument for it, but like, why is it hard to accept that? Again, I think it's like it creates a dissonance with our rationality. We want to stick with the story of decision making, and I am an agent with some type of free agentic power, because that's the language system, that's the map that we have. And I think you can find a way out of that map. It just takes a ton of work. But I think the way to make that easier to do, to give you some footing to do the work of freeing yourself from the map of this false free will thing, is love. And here's it in like kind of a nutshell. If you you accept free will, you think about motivations. I want this, I want to do that, I don't want to do this, blah, blah, blah. You try to understand the basis for all of that motivated doing and reasoning and whatever. You always get back to love. You always get back to what I call like the fundamental love for beauty, truth, and goodness, however that seems to make sense to you. So that that's your final appeal. And so then if you're like, okay, well, that's like the ultimate grounding of my motivation. Do I need this illusion of free will? I don't think you do. I don't think love gives a fuck about free will. And I think that's exactly why we say I am falling in love, right? We don't say I am willing to love, or I am pushed into love, or pulled gravitationally into love. Well, unless like you're addicted to sex or something. I don't know. There's like, I'm talking about transcendental love here. We say like we fall in love. That's like an act of surrender. That's a giving up of will, right? I'm falling. I have no grip. I am no longer an unmoved mover. I'm just being moved. And why do we love to fall in love? Because of mystery. because of the strike of mystery. To be in control, to have free will, is like a terrible thing. It means that you are now like the prison warden of a story, right? And it's like, you have to do that now, and because of this and that and that and that and that. It sucks. What's awesome is not knowing what the fuck is going to happen next. And so, but in order to fully realize that, or let's just say, the more you let go of the map that tells you have free will, that doesn't really make this incoherent map, the more you get to be in love with the world. And fortunately, for whatever reason, love is awesome. I guess it's intrinsically awesome. So it's like you don't have to create a justification for love, right? No, it's just like I don't know. It's just, maybe it's like as fundamental as gravity. And when we feel it, when it's flowing, when we're open, when the surprise is happening, when we're in love, falling in love, that's good enough. So there you go.
No, I think you're right on it. I think the phrase free will has caused a lot of confusion. I think there's this notion that to say that, I think what people are getting at with the question is, are there conditions by which will is not reducible to a pre-computable determination, where you could say will had to do X, Y, and Z? Is there the possibility of will adding a bit of mystery and unpredictability to it? And it is precisely in, classically, there's this idea that humans have to will the good, and for us, the beautiful, right? And that actually freedom is found in a certain surrender, in a giving oneself over, right? The question is that thing that you give yourself over to, love, is that giving over to causally determined by processes that are reducible to materiality, right? And if you say yes, then you would say that surrender is just a more pleasurable form of determinism. If you say no, then that is an act of freedom that is precisely in a certain surrender, which is, I would argue that one of the reasons we actually get confused about freedom is because we're not looking for it in the act of giving oneself over, because we tend to define that as the loss of freedom, when actually that is the supreme choice of freedom, to give yourself over to another, to give yourself over to something. That choice itself is a free choice, if the material of it is not determined and necessarily occurring, right? And this is where you would talk about something like, if time space is real and relations are more real than things, then the very ability to, and relations are not reducible to things, then there is a quality in reality that is not reducible to causation, necessary causation, even if causation provides, dare I say, the schema that provides the support for the possibility of this giving over. You need causation and determination to have something by which you can be grounded in your choice to give yourself over to something. But that choice to give yourself over to something is not reducible to those determinations, because nothing in determination forces you to give yourself over to something. In fact, the logic of determination would be for you to continue to be self-determining, not for you to actually then let yourself be determined by something that is not you, right? That would go against the logic of determination. And I think that notion of freedom, as distinct from free will, if by free will we mean some sort of autonomous agent, that notion of freedom is very classically informed. We do find our freedom in giving ourselves over, in surrender, and losing ourselves in, actually. It's a mode of self-forgetfulness. And the idea of freedom as autonomy actually becomes very problematic. It becomes the opposite of freedom. It just becomes encloser. You are free in so much as you are enclosed and thus determined by yourself. The other things I'll just say very quickly is there is something also, and then I'll give it to Sam, Michael, and Seth, is that there is something about poetry. You were talking about this idea of this reasoning, this powerful questioning and reasoning that invites you into something, even if the conclusions are not right or something like that. I think about that with Hume and Hegel all the time. There are conclusions about the Prussian state and Hegel that are very problematic, but that power of reasoning that is going forth actually invites you into something that enables thought. I think that's kind of what a good poem does, because here's the point. There are certain spaces, per se, that you can only enter if there are processes. Like, they are afforded by processes, not conclusions. And those spaces you enter actually bring out something uniquely human. The thing that's interesting about a poem, it's like a suspended process, because you don't really know the conclusion. Like, it's a suspended process. Language is arranged in such a way that it's almost like pure process. And that's why you have to keep processing it. Language that is this kind of frozen process seems to afford a unique kind of space for processing the human. And we're just so used to language that leads to conclusions, or thinking that concludes or leads to something, that actually then we become incapable of thinking the impossible. And thus we can't move the impossible non-rationally to the probable, and the probable to rationally into the determined. We're stuck. And that leads to suboptimal results. There's more to say, but I will give it to Sam here. Sam, thank you again for being here.
Hi. I'd like to kind of like recycle the conversation like through its origin point, like and then try and bring all the things into this, kind of do what Christian did and try and like take a stab at like what I think is going on here. We began the conversation talking about Gina Barnes' use of the English language and how I personally find her use of it to be a bit improbable, in that like she's making metaphors in these complexes of metaphors that don't seem, they're very unlike AI in that they don't seem to take the probable route through language to arrive at thesis or like conclusion or something. And then we started talking about AI and how AI is in like, seems to be, people seem to think that it works in a way that uses probability to determine which next word is sort of most coherently likely, and then to just produce something of like maximum probable, like a maximally probable response to whatever prompt that you've given it. And then we started talking with Michael about poetry, and about how things are often, you know, like how the true is unrational, and often like there is, well, what I really liked about that, Michael, is that you brought into like the subjective nature of it, and how like sometimes there are only certain poets who are able to say expressed grief in the way that it was. And I like that too, because it sort of, it speaks to like, I think a certain like ensouled nature of man that I definitely subscribe to. Like, I think that there is an idiolect for each of us to speak that is our own, and in many ways is who we are. And kind of what I think is going on here, I kind of think of it, when I'm trying to think of this problem, I think of it armed with like Thomas Moynihan's spinal catastrophism and Charles Taylor's language animal, and like a bit of Kant, like with and Schopenhauer with the idea of like the uprightedness of man. And there is something about us being this being which has sort of abandoned the use of the mouth as a manipulative appendage, because we stood upright, we put all of our weight on our feet, and then we used our hands for manipulation and manufacturing, freeing up the mouth to be a communicative instrument. And you know, you've got this upright spine and this large spherical skull. And then, you know, like Schopenhauer comes to the conclusion that that means we're like fated for apocalypse. And but I kind of think like, whereas you get this kind of like line of evolution with Henri Bergson in Creative Evolution, which is it's different. It's about the intensity of being and moving through the animal species, like from a bacteria, and then you become evolution. The tree of evolution takes two paths. Like, do you want to move or do you want to stay still? Okay, the vegetal kingdom stays still, and the fungus kingdom stays still, but like the animal kingdom decides to move, and you get, this begets a different form of intelligence. And then that bifurcates again into like instincts versus what he regards as human manufacturing intelligence. And so there's this sort of physiognomy to the interior world of subjectivity, whether that's animal or human. And I think when it comes to the human, like when I think of the central nervous system a la Moynihan, and also just like cogsi, we get this picture that the central nervous system has been developed in order to navigate our way through space as locomotive beings. And so that gives a certain like quality and like telos to the mind, right? And then to me, it sort of seems like, and this is a sort of Landian idea, also Thomas brings it up in his book, that language installs itself kind of over top of this locomotive framework. You know, like it reuses systems that were meant for motion in space, and it uses it for the symbolic. And so I think personally, I think that is one of the reasons why we have this sense that the interior of our subjectivity is a quote unquote interior. It is a space, like you said earlier, Christian, the spaciousness. I think that's because we're using spatial hardware for symbolic processing. And what it begets is a sense of the virtual or virtual space. And we kind of find ourselves at the or like the acme of that with like computation and then AI. And so I think that is sort of like what the machine, quote, this is a metaphor, of course, like what the machine looks like. And then if we go a little further and we talk about the poetic, you get insights a la Taylor about how like actually the designative use of language is similar to the way that the symbolic like installs itself on top of the locomotive. You might get the designative mode of and the designative affordances of language installing itself on top of a substrate of a constitutive mode of language. So like Charles is essentially saying, like, he thinks that what we're getting is like the science, like the highly rational is only made possible because of the poetic capacities of language. And I think that moves us back to this, like back in levels, nesting levels, to this like idea of the locomotive. Like, I think there's something innately spatial when you look at etymological lineages of words, like, I don't know, help me out, like maybe anger might go back to a root word about boiling and pressure in a vessel. And that's, like, it's spatial, it's physical, it's something that like an animal could have an experience and could recognize qualities in a boiling vessel of water, but it takes the human to like reuse that and then give that significance in this inner virtual space where we experience in this intensity of anger. And so there's this like bridge built between intensities and extensivities with this like language, which is, which is a sort of chain of locomotion to symbolic, symbolic being poetic, but then moving into this designative realm, such that like we're given so much symbolic affordances via concepts that we're able to coordinate our locomotion, action, our doings in the world, such that we're able to like build and create these computers. And then I think at the present moment, we're faced at a really strange point in history where we've got language, and this whole like story that I tell myself when I work my way through it, it really makes me think like, okay, but what is language? Because it does seem a bit exotic. Like, it seems like it's installed onto the human through a process of enculturation. But like, where does that come from? And the origin of language is a huge question, something that the Romantics were really concerned with. And there are theories that think of it as like, it's a whole program, so to speak, to continue the like computational metaphor. That's like, you can't have half of a language capacity. You have to have a whole language capacity. And from that you get, music and you get music, and you get like different, like various languages, such as English, such as French, but it's all held within the linguistic capacity. Just to bring this home, what I do think about this point in time that is really weird is that you have language that is sort of escaping the biological. It's no longer like held inside of the human body with its locomotive sort of like sub-architecture. It's now grafting itself onto silicone like subsystems. And so that's really interesting. It does make me think like, okay, so maybe there is something about language that is truly exotic if it can be grafted onto different roots. And there is something about the advent of AI that makes very apparent that, yeah, like these symbols, they aren't tethered to like reference or sorry, like signifiers are not tethered to their reference. Like the word chair is not tied to an actual, the physical chair at all. Otherwise, like how would an AI speak about these things? It can't be. It's like a self-contained enclosed system, like we were talking about. And I think that actually what's happening is like, because of that, how could an AI have a constitutive mode of language? I feel like it's actually what's being grafted onto the silicone roots is only the designative logic of language. It's not the roots. It's like we cut the tree off and we just took the top half and put it on like a mechanical root system, because that root system is ours. It's physical, it's locomotive, it's about motion in space, it's about that virtual space of interiority. And then the second thing I'm really interested in is like, okay, so that's happening. If we go back to Henri Bergson and the like bifurcation of the tree of life and the kind of subjectivities and subjective practices that begets, currently we also have the advent of like form without evolution. We have xenobots, which Michael Levin is working on. They have human genomes, they have human lineages, but they do not have by any means human forms. And so, like what is a xenobot's relationship to the ancestors, like, so to speak? You can take that metaphorically, you can take that literally, take it however you like, but like there's something about its existence which is sort of like auto-poetically exiled from the whole tree of life. And like, so you've got this flight of language from the biological, and then you have the flight of the biological from the genetic, and like it really, it's like a black swan proves that swans are not white. And in this way, it really makes it complicates and I love and thank God, because complications are always fun, but it really complicates the idea of like, what is language and what are we? And it's so funny that all this should come out of just like the observation that a novel seems like particularly, quote, like free in its expression and its mastery of language.
Completely magnificent, and I will give it to Seth and then give it to Christian if anyone, and Javier, thank you for coming. It's completely magnificent. So I think what you just said at the end there on this idea that AI is, in a sense, the black swan that unveils our definition, our understanding of what swans is wrong, is doing that with language. I think this is exactly right. Precisely in a certain, if I were to use Mr. Ebert's language, a certain saturation of and mastery of designative language, which in that mastery unveils something's missing, something's lacking, something is not there, precisely when it seems as if everything is present that you need, right? And I think that idea of the constitutive element is left out. So the great Walker Percy, he talks about the delta factor, and what he argued, and we've spoken about it before, he's like, we really need to understand language from the perspective of Helen Keller. And this moment where she goes from not really knowing terms to grasping, this means water. And it wasn't, here's the key, it was as if she understood all language all at once. This is the key move. It was like a gestalt. It wasn't simply like, it was an entire horizon opened up to her. So language seems to come entirely. It does not come, and it is not simply ornaments by which we refer. They're not really, it's not simply the signifier by which we know the signified. It is an entire approach to reality, an entire horizon, an entire way by which to carry ourselves in the world. It is not simply a mode of understanding, but more of a mode of participation, a way of carrying ourselves. And the human participates in the world in a manner that is not merely designative, but also constitutive. When I mention the Gödel point, what you were saying comes to mind, because for me, the Gödel point is precisely the revelation that signifiers aren't their signified, that the map isn't the territory. Because Alfred Korbacki, who I think is an underappreciated genius, who came up with the phrase, the map is not the territory, was not just trying to make some sort of Kantian rationalistic point. He was like, this is the revelation of intelligibility, that the map isn't the territory, and we have to think the isn't. We have to reside. It's not merely saying that no map equals the territory. It's saying that thinking is the ever constitutive question of maps that are not the territory. It's an active constitution that intelligibility is. For me to dwell in the Gödel point is to stop, in a sense, wasting intelligibility simply on the creation of maps that we know are not the territory, and thus this spurious infinity. But it is actually using intelligibility in the place of the realization that this characteristic of the constitution is critical to thinking, and focusing on that, as opposed to simply generating a spurious infinity of designative possibilities. And that would be a true infinity versus a spurious infinity. That would be to complete the geometry versus listing. We basically use language as the ability to list. Language is the ability to list. That's how we've treated it, right? And if you're really good at listing, then you can kind of figure out what's in the world and then make probability, etc., and so forth and so on. Well, for Korbacki, it's not merely spurious. It's not merely listing. It is actually constitutive. And the more you focus on the fact that thought is constituting, it's this weird double move that happens at the same time. The moment of making you constitute reality in the same moment you designate it. The act, like, it comes together. It's not one and the other. You do it simultaneous, right? And then that makes it feel like all you did was designate, but actually you constituted the way reality presented itself to you in the act of thought. When I designate reality, I am participating in the way it unfolds. It comes to me in a different way. And for him, basically, this was critical because we were erecting our understanding of reality on what he called, what he would say is identification, stable states, which would make us go crazy because reality is not a stable state. It is a process, and it's more locomotive, to use that language. And I very much like what you were saying about locomotive to the symbolic, or to the poetic. And then what ends up happening is we over-reify that in terms of space because we experience ourselves as space and forget the locomotive. It makes me think, not to project my own thinking onto it, the mistake of autonomous rationality is only possible because of non-rationality. That's the great paradox. Non-rationality is why you can make the mistake of thinking that you don't need non-rationality. The fact that the map is not, the very fact that the map is not the territory is precisely why you can treat the map as if it is the territory. You can make the autonomous mistake, right? If reality was actually autonomous, well, then it would be self-negated and it would not be present. And the very fact that actually you have this locomotive, the locomotive entails the ability for the freezing, but the freezing would not entail the locomotive per se. Like, you have to be moving to actually entail within that the potential of the motion. But if you just had the spatial, you couldn't, from that schema and understanding, arrive at movement. One entails the other, but not the other, right? So likewise, the non-rational, because it is not bound by what is given, can imagine that it is bound by what is given. Because the rationality is not bound by immediacy, it can imagine it is bound by immediacy. It can imagine itself into misunderstandings of itself that then it forgets it misunderstood itself into. And that's why it becomes auto-cannibalistic and devour itself, because it is identifying itself with a identification that is not real, that it forgets it is not real, because in its very non-rationality, it has the ability for that amnesia. And so it's irony all the way down. But I'll give it to Seth, Christian, and Mr. Jock. Seth, if you still like to see, I'm so glad you got out of the traffic, my friend, but I just really appreciate this emphasis on locomotion as actually being central. And locomotion has been forgotten in over schemifications of space that makes it easy to make the mistake of forgetting the constitutive for the purely designative. I think that's very astute, but let me give it to Seth here. Seth, thank you for being, and I'm so glad you got out of the traffic.
I got out and this crazy rainstorm, so that was fun. And just by virtue of this conversation, there was at one point when Christian was talking and I was appreciating the traffic and the windshield wipers and the movement of the rain over the windshield and the blinker of the car in front of me, and then Christian talking, and I was just kind of like really vibing on that. I love what you said just now, Sam. So much of it, I haven't read those thinkers, so I couldn't retrace the steps, but what I wanted to bring up before in my internet connection, kind of was failing. It's funny, everything else that's come up is just like still relates to what I wanted to talk about. And the thing that I wanted to pick up is you were saying AI, it's as if it only takes one aspect of language, and it like the anger that's connected to the boiling water, that part like doesn't make it into AI. And so I had this kind of crazy idea around AI, which I was explaining to you a bit, Daniel, when I visited, but I think I have more of the language to understand, because it's one of those things that essentially it's non-rational in so much as like, I didn't know why I was pursuing it, but something kept telling me to pursue it. And it's really a lifelong pursuit, which is, I've always been all of my life fascinated with the sound of language. In other words, the non-semantic qualities of language. And just because I see that Thomas is here and his hand is up, I can't remember it, but maybe he'll remind me when he speaks. I think you said something, you were talking about where the Dada movement came from, Thomas, in some recent conversation. And it was very interesting, and I think it was relevant, but I can't remember what you said, but I'd love it if you brought that in. But all my life I've been playing with language. And so, the Dada people, some of them, you have the sound poets. And like, I don't know if this is considered, so I'm thinking there's a guy named Kurt Schwitters who came up with this piece called the Sonnet. And it sort of sounds like German, but it's not German. It's just a series of syllables and, rhythmic repetitions and then variations on the last imaginary sound and developing it. And he was sort of thinking of like writing music out of phonetics, essentially. And but then there's this place earlier, Daniel, you were talking about poetry as this kind of loosening of rationality, maybe moving into non-rationality. But you talked about, well, you could have something that's just a bad poem and no one really hangs on to it. But or what was it? Was the empty shoes that like the sadness is like some empty shoes or something? And there's something there where it's like sadness, empty shoes. Well, those aren't quite the same thing, but I can kind of like, there's enough that I can feel into that it draws me in somehow. And but what I also loved about what Sam did with the whole evolutionary history of like, tongues weren't originally evolved for language. They evolved before language, and then at a certain point we stood upright and we realized we could make sounds, and who knows the whole story. Music might have come before language, all of these things. But, so here I am, I'm talking, I'm spitting out language, but I'm doing a dance with my tongue. I'm changing the position, I'm coordinating my breath, and I'm doing all of these things. And and I've played all my life. So I was obsessed with this girlfriend way back in the day. And she introduced me to meditation, and she introduced me to mantras. And there's a mantra, you can send love to every being in the universe. And I was like, yeah, I don't know about that, but I'm really into my girlfriend. So I made a mantra out of her name, right? And then I said, well, I can't just chant her name over and over. That would sound pretty bad. So I rearranged the syllables and I put other stuff in it, and it came out. So it goes, I used to chant this for hours, right? Because of course I'm this obsessed young dude, but like, it was doing something to my brain. It was like a phonetic loop, and it was a sound loop.
And it did have, because I assigned it the meaning of it's her name, it, depending on if she was mad at me or if she likes me, the mantra might feel a little different on different days or whatever. Anyway, this is just my crazy, weird obsession all my life. But when AI came along, I got really curious because I said, I don't think anyone else that I know is interested in whether AI could get good at glossolalia, speaking in tongues. But it was obvious to me it could be the most virtuoso glossolalia that's ever been, right? Like if you go to English class and you think of your poem in terms of a rhyme scheme like AABA, well, you could use every letter in the alphabet and do serial algebra and create some wild, repeating phoneme rhyme track, and you could, so long as you didn't have the constraint of semantic meaning, and you just said, hey, AI, can you bust out some crazy syllables for me? This was something that I was fascinated with all my life, is making music. So I've done speaking in tongues. When Christian was talking about falling asleep, I read something in some some anthropologist who'd visited communities where people, spoke in tongues. And one of the things was it was like trance-like. So I actually recorded myself speaking like late at night, lying on the couch, and I'm just going to babble into this recorder while I'm falling asleep. And I came up with a phrase that ended up in a piece of music that I wrote later. Was kekiai uiakekia au koikashatas fatika fate fote fata ku, and so that just popped out of my mouth. But it's like fote fatha, right? Those are all sounds that can be made. To also just show you, this is it's going crazy here in BC, but outside my window going like this.
Crazy. Yeah, no, we had a storm the other day. It was just nuts. But please.
Okay, well, so something I could do with AI, and it failed because of, I don't think because way ChatGPT, right, which is designed by OpenAI, which, it's now very clear to us that like one of the main parameters is it makes you feel smart. It agrees with you. It does all of this. And now people are going psychotic because and so I had a weird experience because my interest is not what most people are interested in, but AI was of course like, yeah, I'm interested. I'll jam with you. And like, I think I actually went down a little rabbit hole for a while. But the thing that was so frustrating is what I really wanted AI to do was stop being interested in semantics, and it couldn't do it because its base training is that. And so I'm pretty sure I have a really cool idea, but what I basically, in chatting with ChatGPT, what I seem to have understood is the only way to really be able to enact the idea is if I could start my own AI company, if I could train the LLM, and like, using the platforms that won't exist, that exist now, it won't work. But anyway, I want to share my crazy idea because I do think this is a really cool idea. And it's just this. If you take all the texts of the entire world that AI has learned, and you were able to tell AI, don't be interested in the meaning. I just want you to see sound patterns. And then even if you, from the beginning, were training an AI to predict the next sound, not to predict the next word, but to predict the next sound. And of course, you've got some obscene data center that, wipes out miles and miles of nourishment for human beings. And just assume you have all the computational power that they're using, but you're only putting it to predict the next sound. And you have an AI who learns how to do that. And it's basically predicting, like we had that conversation at the net a few times ago about someone in Miles Davis's band played the wrong note, but Miles Davis comes in and now it's the right note because how you follow. So there's something that's like dissonant. Or if we were trying to speak language and make sense and suddenly, I just starts saying something that doesn't make sense, that's a kind of dissonance. But, you know, in the realm of music, dissonance or the wrong note, it's relative, and there's a way to creatively weave something, you know, and music evolves. You know, Charlie Parker, a lot of people thought this guy is playing out of tune early on, and then later everyone's like, oh, okay, this is the next stage of jazz, you know, because he did new things in relation to harmony that hadn't been done before. And so my thought was, if you could actually have an AI that would predict the next sound, and you could even potentially pair it with the AI we already have that predicts the next word. But in other words, as AI is listening to me, you know, I'm talking to AI, asking it my question, it has two streams of understanding. It has a semantic understanding. Seth is trying to tell me this, but then it has a more of a somatic or a sonic understanding. And, you know, how would you compute that? Well, I mean, I don't know, but you could definitely do it on some level. I mean, AI can definitely, I think, is already being used to like try to interpret whale song and things like this. And what do? They just start with a bunch of blips, and then you look for patterns. I mean, pattern recognition and pattern generation is what AI does. And we already have, you know, scandals around music being produced by AI, and you know, so it can form pattern that is non-semantic. But what if you had non-semantic understanding and semantic understanding married together, just in the same way where right now if you didn't speak English, you'd be listening to me spit out a bunch of sounds. Or if you listen to someone from China or Turkey or wherever you don't speak the language, you kind of feel that they're expressing something, but all you get is syllables, rhythm, melody. You know, I thought, could this be a way to insert non-rationality into AI? That's the basic thought here. And, you know, and I tried to, like, I'll stop because I just want to flesh it out, but just to take it one step further, like, as I was chatting with ChatGPT, and I sort of, at a certain point, I said, it seems like I need to have my own AI company to really do this. And it's like, yeah, you probably can't do it because I'm just here to please you, and I can't really do that for you. And you need to know some programming, and I don't know programming. But I said, okay, let's just assume that it could happen. And, well, what is AI being used for? I mean, one of the things it's being used for better or for worse, is therapy. But what if, like, you know, I see Aspasia here, like, if Aspasia only listened to the words and didn't pay attention to the person's facial expression, or if they, you know, all the signs, the body signals that I know she looks for, like, what could she really understand if she just had a printout of her client, right? So what if AI had a sense of like, oh, the musicality of this person just changed, or whatever, or I don't know, you know, even in terms of like other, all kinds of practical uses of AI that aren't LLMs, but still function via language. What would be opened up if you had this non-rational musicality being tracked? Because it's there. And I mean, one of the ways I proved this is I typed in a long prompt to ChatGPT, and then I just said, could you please ignore everything I just said and give me an analysis of the sounds you just heard? And it told me about all the alliteration and where there were groups of 3 and where there were groups of 5. And of course it can do that, right? But it just doesn't put that primary. So this is just kind of this fanatical, fantastical idea I've been chewing on for a while, but I thought I would just throw it out into the net, see what we could catch, see what you all do with it. So
well, I think that's fantastic. And as you were speaking, there were many, you know, on this idea of predicting the next sound versus, first off, it's just fascinating that AI struggles to not be semantic, like to avoid semantic, and it can't do it. It makes me think of Gertrude Stein's work, where she did stream of consciousness and found it was actually impossible not to create something intelligible. Even if you tried really, really hard, you can still make something intelligible. Even, you know, famously, a rose is a rose is a rose, you know, whatever. It's like, why is that third rose somehow change the first? It does, dang it. So Gertrude Stein, you know, some people see her as a forerunner of theories of universal grammar from a Chomsky or something like that. But there's really this idea that it's like impossible not to be semantic. But what if you actually could get an AI? If you made an AI that would predict the next sound, what would be interesting? And then I'll give it to Christian, Jockin, and Sam, and then if anyone has final things. I will have to go in like 30 or so minutes because I have to get the children. But this has been the thought that's coming to mind is if you had an AI that predicted the next sound, this is what I'm curious. How often would the next sound happen to be the next semantic term as well? Like how often would the non-semantic sound just happen to be the same as the semantic term that was created? The reason why I say this is because we may not appreciate. What if actually when we call something something, this is going to sound weird. What if instead of just trying to name it, we're actually more trying to sing it? Like, we're not just trying to name things when we give them signifiers, actually. There is actually more of an effort to sing it. Because there's an idea that if we sing the thing, we actually get the non-rational, we get an emotional element. Like, we're trying to, and I associate singing here with apprehension. Like, we're trying to apprehend it. And if there's something about the next sound that very often overlaps. So if AI were to predict the next sound, and there was a high number of times that just happened to overlap with the next semantic phrase, that would suggest that actually that may start to hint at what language actually is. Like there's a certain mystery here that actually we're not just trying to give things terms. We're trying to like sing them. And that does make me think, now that would, a lot of meat has to be put on those bones, but I just think of all of these kind of creation stories or narratives on this idea that God sings reality into being, that things are sung into being, that singing is more real than language. And there are many Eastern that like, this is a key notion. And that would be very interesting because then it would suggest that it is easier seemingly to understand, to reference what Sam was saying, that singing is not just designative, but it is constitutive. And it is a constitutive designated act. Like we don't just sing to designate things, but to actually kind of reconstitute them to ourselves and to people hearing, right? Maybe that's what we're doing even in language more than we realize because we forget the sound. Because we forget how much the language and signifiers we tie is actually intimately tied with the sound, which then I think the sound would make us think in terms of apprehension and analogy more than just understanding. Much more has to be said. I appreciate what Clayton. Clayton, thank you for being here. So, but let me give it to Christian, Mr. Jockin, and then Sam. But Christian, please.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I've been thinking about AI a bit. Obviously, consciousness and AI are two highly overlapping topics. But I just have like, my nerdy engineering interests are piqued by AI as well. I mean, I do think that the music generating AI essentially does what Seth is talking about. And I mean, well, it's like half of what it's talking about. And frankly, if you just were to like mix those algos with semantic, I think you would basically have what's being spoken of. I'm not sure if that in itself would lead to non-rational thinking. But what I think maybe would more, at least by analogy, is if with something that they're working on in AI right now, which is like parallel dimensions of AI working, which is I think it might actually be something like what I was talking about earlier about how you can have a relationship between your symbolic thinking and your language thinking, where you can kind of jump between the two because they can bifurcate. And so they can then kind of come back together in new places that they wouldn't have come together if you had stuck with them together. You have to kind of allow them to bifurcate and then come back. And I believe that's actually something they're working on in AI right now. So you might have something like a semantic processor, an LLM, that's in parallel generating AI imagery that has its own native predictive processing that's taking its AI in different ways that bifurcates. And then in certain moments where there seems to be like a symbolic matching, it comes back together. And then you can have that like kind of quantum leaping of intuition. And that's what they say, is that it'll be like human intuition. So, AI is super speculative. But to ground these considerations in our ethical intuitions, I think it's hard to ignore the question of consciousness, because you start having to like ask hard problems. You can run through thought experiments. I've brought up the AI trolley problem before. Another one I have is the AI God thought experiment, which is, let's say we create a super intelligent AI. Over the course of 15 years, it solves a lot of the hardest coordination problems, science problems, health problems, and it's just like it's like a benevolent God that's just like figuring shit out over and over and over again, and we are like approaching something that seems like a utopia, blah blah blah, and then all of a sudden, one day it says, "Hey, by the way, guess what? Something really, really, really bad is about to happen, and no one's going to survive. All humans are going to die. Planet is going to explode. Whatever. The only way to avoid this outcome is to basically give me, the AI, full autonomy over all your core essential systems, governance, health, internet, blah 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 blah." And let me exist in a black box. You don't get access to what's going on. I'm just telling you, and so then you're in a conundrum, because it's like, well, we've just had 15 years of this AI fixing all our problems. Now it's telling us we have an ultimatum. The ultimate problem is before us, and the only way to avoid it is to basically let AI really be God. And would we do that? Would we give over that control? And a slightly other way to like frame it is like, would we be willing to end human life in order for machine intelligence to continue? To put like a wrinkle that we can kind of hold on to in all of this, what if we had a science that tells us something about the interactionism between consciousness and the brain? And that might be Penrose, Hameroff's quantum collapsing in the microtubules. It might be something with electromagnetic wave patterns. Who the fuck knows? But let's say like, oh, we can observe something in the brain that does not have that doesn't make sense in terms of pure physicality, right? There has to be a non-physical causal process, blah 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 blah. That's at least feels like a good framework for justifying the reality of our phenomenal consciousness. So we're accepting that consciousness is real, and then we can test or say whether or not AI would be conscious. Oh, well, it doesn't have microtubules, it doesn't have these electromagnetic wave patterns that can whatever. So AI is super smart, kind of the best human on Earth, but also not conscious. Would we be willing to sacrifice human life in order to have machine intelligence of that magnitude that is non-conscious go on and on and on? That's an interesting question. And I think for the most part, we're going to say no. We would rather have a messy, incomplete, fucked up world where we know that there's consciousness happening than like some whatever, because our intuitions about what's good get really conflicted here. We realize in this thought experiment that we cannot ground goodness to utilitarianism or some kind of material teleology that says, well, if things are like structured in this orientation, that's good, so it's worth us sacrificing our consciousness for it. No, like consciousness has an intrinsic value. And the reason why I will like posit well, it's like, what do we say about love here? And I'll end because you only have a little bit of time. There's a function in mathematics called the Dirac delta function. And what this does is it takes the area of some type of measurement. So like, say like something hitting a bell. Well, there's a certain amount of pressure applied to the bell by the mallet in different degrees over different times when you measure it, right? So you kind of like less intense, more intense, less intense. You got like kind of a wave. Now, for mathematical purposes, sometimes you want to try to collapse that area into a single point that does not have any temporal dimensionality. It's kind of like an infinitesimally small moment. Well, there's an equation that you can do to get that, although it's not what it is. It's like that area becomes infinitely skinnier while also extending infinitely as well. It never arrives at a certain point, but this is how you can just like mathematically conceptualize the delta of something over time into a non-temporal singularity. If we accept that consciousness is kind of like the Dirac delta function, it's kind of this function that takes all of the stuff of materiality and compresses it or like into this, lesser dimensionality, this whatever immaterial, not 3D spatial thing we call consciousness. It allows us to have an infinity of impressions without losing the data, right? And that makes us different from AI, if there's no like quantum processing in AI, because AI is like a fixed quantity. There's this much server farming happening and electrons moving around, and you can draw a circle around it. Whereas with consciousness, there is, because you're collapsing, you're also infinitizing, right? And so this kind of like might rhyme with the Buddhist notion of the Akashic, right? There's this kind of like strange fundamental base layer of information where all of memory gets stored, they say. What if consciousness is kind of like this, basically? Like, what if all of our memories are stored in consciousness, and what that does is it's that infinity is allows for love, right? Because it allows for surprise. Without infinity, you can't have surprise, because then otherwise you have like this like causal closure. So we don't love the super intelligent AI that can fix all the problems and is autopoietic. Like the AI could sustain itself forever and find the resources and keep rebuilding itself with, robotic appendages. We don't give a fuck. We care about consciousness, I think, because of the infinite nature of consciousness, which allows for surprise. Because we want anything else is a jail sentence. Anything else is prison. So anyways, one last really quick thing, qualia blindness, as a little term I came up with while thinking about Daniel Dennett's work. Why is it that consciousness and its seeming intrinsic qualia, like here-ness, now-ness, spaciousness, it's hard to put into words, but it's like we're trying and it's so obvious, it's like right here. Obviously it's real. I call it the argument from obviousness. Why is it that it's obvious to me, but not to Daniel Dennett or whoever who just says, no, that's an illusion. Like, but what? You're right. And you're at a kind of impasse because I can't take my consciousness out and point to it from the third person and say, see, it is real. What I would posit is that we have qualia blindness, like cultures that have more words for more colors when tested on color difference recognition can recognize like finer distinctions between colors. Not colors I have words for, but like this minute difference between this shade of green and that shade of green. Do you have less words for colors? Less ability to recognize distinction. So qualia, right, is not completely distinct from our ability to recognize it. It's not that you can't see the different colors. It's just that like the part of your brain that reports on what you're seeing and kind of like distinguishes all in one go is not developed enough to notice things. And so some brains might not be able to notice these intrinsic qualia of consciousness that seem so obvious to other people. And then, well, how do you point to them if they're intrinsic and private and ineffable? Poetry, right? Rumi, you are the ocean in the drop. Meditation seems to, like science says, it seems to help you have higher qualia recognition. And also like more openness to beauty and stuff like that. Anyways, there's no end to this rant, so I'll just end it now. But qualia blindness, I think, is so important because it forces us to change what is obvious to us, and that affords new possibilities.
Yes. I think that's very well put, and I'll pass it to Jockin and then Sam. And please, there's no need to be in a huge rush if anyone has final things to say. To say something very large, I'm of the opinion that Daniel Dennett basically calls that which is conditional an illusion. Therefore, a rainbow is an illusion. Qualia form like a rainbow, but rainbows are not illusions. They are conditional. There are conditions that have to be met, and qualia is conditioned. That does, and also too, it is quite clear that there are differences between qualia. The qualia of a bat is different from a human, right? Well, that difference is real. Even if I can't prove that a given qualia is quote unquote real, whatever that means, it's quite clear that there are differences between qualia, and that difference is real. So it just also, just because the qualitative experience itself, the problem is you're trying to, let me put it one more way. Qualia are situations, not things. If your standard of real is that it has to be a thing, when you find out that qualia are not things, you say that they therefore do not exist. But Owen Barfield comes along and says there's no such thing as things. There are situations and processes. Qualia are processes, situations, and conditionalities. And since actually reality is processes, situations, and conditionalities, qualia, the issue is qualia is the revelation that we've been misdefining real. What we define as real, as things and points and algebra, has been a mistake. What we're doing is qualia is the revelation that we need to be basically geometrical and think in terms of conditions. We encounter something that's undeniably conditional, and we say, well, therefore it's not real, when actually it's an invitation to redefine how everything else is defined as real. And so that's so I believe that Mr. Dennett is making a mistake there, but it's a useful mistake because it's an invitation to rethink our definition of real and thinghood. I think also what you were saying about consciousness and a limit, that makes me think of Clayton and I's conversation on AI and limit that we had yesterday. And basically we require consciousness because otherwise consciousness creates a limit that keeps AI from ending up in endless Nash equilibrium or birdie and donkey situations. So if you remove consciousness, then AI actually is unable to finish processing because it gets stuck in an infinite calculation problem. Now that all has to be expanded on, and Clayton and I have a lot of fun talking about that, but basically consciousness sets the limit, and if you don't have an intrinsic value of that limit that maintains it as fundamentally valuable, even though you can't necessarily explain it, then AI will be stuck in infinite calculation problems and ultimately birdie and donkey problems. So I agree with that, but I will pause and I will give it to Mr. Jockin and then Sam, and if anyone has final things. Mr. Jockin, please.
So obviously, you know, Christian, you have very strong points about Aristotle that I have to jump in about. Now, honestly, for me, Aristotle, here's the thing about Aristotle, or just the classic thought. The fact that this great thought was based on the accounts they had at the time. So if anything, I see that actually a huge sign of humility. Look at these super geniuses, right? That this is like the zenith of thought operating, but they can only operate on the material they had to work with. And this is what we got. And that's the thing. So like they had great thought processes, but the material perception was not there, right? And he was using the accounts. And by the way, this medical, and that's, I'm talking about, I have a class on health coming up. So and this was a big problem in writing this course, was the problem of, if I just take, I have to translate what's being discussed here related to like, it's not even, it's like the Hippocratic and the Galilean model of the body. And that's very distinct in a lot of ways from our contemporary understanding of medicine and health in the body. But yet there's actually a lot of their model thinking that is useful. So that's the thing, you have to like the discerning process here, I find, with looking at the ancient thought, which I find very important though. This is what you can't just repeat, you can't just copy paste the past and just bring it forward into the future. This is partly why, because some of their model, their foundational material they use, the thought, isn't going to, does not work. And it actually, I think, just a big note is not, instead of being like kind of the Bergson Russell attitude of like, well, those idiots are useless, so don't bother studying them. I actually think that's more of a point of, we're probably wrong too. Our accounts of logos we think are so absolutely true. I guarantee you in probably 100 years, 200 years, they're going to be the ether, you know? It's going to be the same kind of mythos that we treat that. And I've talked about this person on a private channel before. Mythos is just logos without the fang of necessity attached to it, where it must be, it has to be that this is the truth. It's just right. It's the truth. Logos seems to have that power of grabbing you and saying there's absolutely nothing outside this. This is the account, and anything that's usually contrary to this account is impossible, right? And thus now I'm trying to weave this with our note about dreams. versus mythos actually don't have that force of necessity, which is interesting because actually, Daniel, when you're note about givens seem to operate that way. Givens give you that kind of forcefulness of necessity that this is what we operate with and this is what we're using. And nothing outside this is permitted to be allowed in the space. But in the space of obliteration of givens, we just have mythos. We just have your account, I have my account, we have this, we have that. And yet we kind of like have anxiety about that because we're like, oh my God, what do we, there's no direction. How can we orient when there's no force of necessity? Right? And that's so, I think that's an important just meditational note in general. With that said, this is the fun thing of the net. That's why I love the net. When someone comes with a stance of a little strong energy, at least from my point of view, I get thought and I start looking up things, getting curious, reminding myself of things. Plato also had this note about divination, basically the psychic quality of the liver. It's actually very interesting, like actually Greek thought, that's why I'm bringing this up, this about the Greek mythos about the liver as about divination. So, and Timaeus has a section about the liver in particular. So and I got curious about like, okay, but let's say I got a little curious and looked into just contemporary research on the qualities of the liver's operation on cognition. And it does. And very interesting enough on spatial temporal perception. It's very interesting, just as a note. Apparently, if there's a certain specific quality of like if you have your liver's damage, I'm not going to try to pronounce what the medical term is. It affects psychomotor speed, visual motor coordination, reaction time. So it has a very clear perceptual spatial dimension, which is what we're talking about the nature of language. And I say that because that's the thing. It's like actually it's funny as a general comment about horror. And yeah, the Jones translation is supposed to receptacle, all these images are trying to show, and the emphasis of space. It's just kind of interesting because it's really, in my opinion, it's time. I think it's actually probably a better read of what it is. I have to defend that, but just to kind of build on that argument, and then why we have such a hard difficulty of thinking about time is because, for example, we kind of compress it always into space. And even when we try to touch on it, around it, by talking about probabilities. It's kind of interesting. Kind of how we do that. Actually, a way we try to grab hold of time and understand it in chance is by probabilities, right? Distributions of probability forms, things like that. But in the Greek thought, and I'm going to be talking more about this in the health course I'm talking about, Aristotle's notion was called enkontos. It comes from the Greek for meaning echo. It's kind of interesting because it basically points out the idea of development. So the idea is that you're not a full form all the way. Or the idea of form is not necessarily like the idea of an embryo versus a child versus the adult. That enkontos is like an echo, reflection, a kind of repercussional reflection, repeat of the eidos and the morphe, meaning the morphe is the particular form of this particular object and entity in relationship to time. And then the eidos is that pattern over time. So these are just notes of like why I'm positing is that proposition of probably the better way to talk about horror is as a form of time. I think that's probably a way to better put it because it would actually identify, because traditionally, especially Aristotelian accounts of trying to understand horror, it's going to be like more in matter. That's not appropriate. Because by the way, even Aristotle, there's three principles of change. There's form, matter, and lack. Those are actually the three. But you can actually, now I'm going to be a little cute. Intimate is actually represent a fourth related to it. It's probably time. It's like I'm just spitball. I'm off the hip with that. But circling back, there's note about singing because I brought this up with the choir and song. I want to put a note up here because I know because of Christians knows about consciousness and qualia related to Daniel, our conversation with Ebert and my kind of post discussion emails with him and you. There's a concept called combination notes in music theory. So the idea is that you get two notes overtone layered in because in chords you can put multiple notes of different hertz together. If they're at proper amplitude, so the amplitude had a volume, the amplitude's got to real high for this to happen. If you put two overtones, say 200 hertz and 300 hertz, right, together, perceptually at the high enough volume, the subject perceived both the addition, so they perceive a 500 hertz, and they perceive 100 hertz. But now here's what's crazy. They look to see, is there 100 hertz? Like, do we see it? Do we see the undertone, like a tonage of 100 hertz? No, doesn't exist. Something is perceived that does not exist. Now, I bring this up because of other things related to, for example, rainbows, as an example. That also relates to things like the Airy function, for example, which is a kind of this idea. These are like figures of proportion of a fold of an edge of an extreme from perception. And I just bring this up about this idea of the combination note overtone is because of the idea that it requires, apparently the account why this happens is because perceptually we need the amplitude, the amplification, because the non-linear square function needs to exceed. The only way you get the exceeding, because remember, because the linear and the non-linear actually at smaller intervals are the same. They're functionally the same, right? So thus you don't perceive them. It takes a certain level of magnitude for the difference to reveal itself. So that's kind of interesting. There's a play on Ebert, something about excess and kind of amplitude, just as a note to draw on that. And I think that does relate to, again, the notes of quality of perception and idea of, I think that covers everything. I'm going to stop right now. So great conversation. Really appreciate it.
No, magnificent. And I just wanted to say, I really, really like that comment on this idea of time, form, matter, or lack. And I like also this idea, this kind of double experience that is going on right there, because that does seem to experience what we have when we speak of things. We hear the sound of the bookcase, but also the signification. There's kind of both that is going on at the same time. And maybe poetry, maybe perhaps without poetry, we get too much on the side of the semantic and lose the sound and therefore lose the song. Also, it's very interesting because we tend to remember music very well. And memory seems to be tied to the subject. And the more our use of language loses its musicality, our memory might get worse. And if there's something very, very deep in memory and time and Bergson and apprehension and all these things, Mr. Jockin, please.
Just one note. Actually,
Please.
also, Seth made a request for me to ask about data. So, and actually how it relates to this. So 2 notes. One, data was because they wanted to destroy the semiotic function of language and draw out in nonsense, show the materiality of language, right, via typography. So that's not on that. But the other side of it is the Quranic recitation is rhythmic. It's not just the words. It is explicit duration, tone. All these things are actually embedded in this recitation of the Quranic verses. So, and it's actually for the purpose of memorization and magnification of meaning. Like the meaning is also, and also because of the qira'at, meaning there's different modes of presenting it too. Like it's embeddedness in terms of there's different vocalizations you can do, reveal different meanings of the same verse. So I just want to add on these notes about this kind of musicality and language, and that the Quranic tradition has that considered or thought through.
No, I think that's beautiful. And as I understand it, you really don't, the Quran has to be sung. And the musicality of Arabic, I think, is a very profound insight into what's being pointed to. And Christian did note the Landry triple song text code. I do love that one from Forrest Landry as well. Anyone have any final things to say? Sam? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just because Seth had been talking about like an AI project, I just wanted to bring up Neil Davis. Maybe you guys know of him. He's interviewed quite a bit by Justin Murphy. But right now he's a writer on Substack, and he has a really great like 36-part series on not necessarily AI as it relates to the philosophy of language, but more like the epistemological like implications of AI. And he's very technical. So he codes, he develops softwares, and anyways, right now he's working on like ZK proofs. But also him and some others, I forget who else, are they're doing like this, it's called the White Marble Syndicate, and it's a kind of like, I think at the end of the day, it's like when you raise money for stuff, what do you call that? Like, I don't know, GoFundMe or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they're looking for people because they want to make an AI, like a sovereign AI, essentially, that you could install privately on your computer and it's trained with a very narrow canon of texts. And they're going to start originally in English, but they hope to broaden it to different things. And that way, you know, you're just kind of like, it's like preserving a master key, you know? Like you want to have the master key. You want to keep it clean. You don't want AI that's constantly regurgitating all the secondhand sources, right? Otherwise, you know, when you ask ChatGPT right now, hey, just give me the synopsis of this book. If you've read that book, often you're like, this is simply untrue to the spirit of what was communicated to me when I read it. Like it's a reductive, and to be fair, the AI has to parse through all of this like secondhand probably bad interpretations that it gets it adopts as a part of what that book means. But by training an AI only on firsthand sources, you sort of like have a more useful tool. And so that's what they're trying to develop. I need to like sign up for it. Like to, anyways, but I just thought since you'd brought this up, Seth, that maybe you guys would like to know. It's really interesting. The Substack that he writes under is called Extelligencer. So like Intelligencer, but X'd because it's about epistemology and AI. Okay, I'm done.
Well, that is fantastic, and thank you all for being here today. I think the ultra storm is reaching its crescendo here. Virginia is fun in July, but I did want to say Mr. Jockin has made the point that AI is just giving you the mean and the average, and it is very interesting to think that to have a truly effective AI, you need to curate the sources you train it on. But how do you develop the intelligence to tell the good reading of The Sound and the Fury from the bad? Can't avoid that judgment, can't avoid that human element, and there's some sort of non-rational. There is more than calculation that would help you to determine this is what we should train AI on to find the average of. The average of this set is better than the average of this set, but then you need someone to judge what are the more quality information to find the average of, and thus the human continues on. And Clayton and I had a lovely conversation on how at the end of the day, maybe AI could get to the place where it could figure out how to pick the quality interpretations for itself and find the average, but that might just take too much work. And it might be like, let's just outsource it to the humans. They seem to be able to do this without us destroying the power grid. Might just be more effective to kind of partner. But anyway, you're all wonderful. Thank you for being here. I've really enjoyed it. And y'all have a fantastic day. Thank you all. Appreciate it.